And he said, "You have to come into the toilets." And I said no. And then he grabbed me and picked me up and took me into the toilets. I told him I was going to tell my mum. And he started to strangle me. He threatened he was going to kill me. He grabbed me by the throat. And if I didn't do it, I thought I was going to die.
He took a lot away from you, didn't he?
He took everything. He took my life.
You know, he's been a demon for nearly 30 years. It's just a shocking record.
But that was just a cover for the evil man he is. He's not even a man. I don't even know what to call him.
Good evening. On Sunday afternoon, a schoolboy set out to buy Christmas presents for his family. 13-year-old Daniel Morcombe hasn't been seen since.
Not knowing where he was and what happened was awful.
Warning, of the story you are about to watch is based on real events. Some scenes may be disturbing to certain viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The morning of August 21st, 2011, a line of police officers moved carefully through dense undergrowth at an old sand mining site in the Glass House Mountains, Queensland. Spreading out, shovels in hand, eyes on the ground. They weren't here by chance. They were here because a man in custody, just hours earlier, had told them exactly where to look. For almost 8 years, this patch of Australian bushland had kept a secret that a mother and father had waited nearly 3,000 days to have answered, a secret that had outlasted rewards, search parties, false leads, and years of silence. And then, a shoe, small, worn, matching almost exactly what a 13-year-old boy had been wearing the last time anyone saw him alive. Then came the bones. What police uncovered that day would finally bring an end to one of the most exhaustive investigations in Queensland's history. But this wasn't a lucky break. It wasn't a tip that came out of nowhere. It was the final move in an operation so elaborate, so carefully constructed, that the man responsible had spent months walking straight into it, without ever realizing it was a trap. He thought he was talking to criminals. He thought he was earning the trust of a powerful crime syndicate. A chance at money, at belonging, at proving his loyalty. He had no idea he was confessing to the police the entire time. This is the story of how a 13-year-old boy named Daniel Morcombe vanished from a quiet bus stop on the Sunshine Coast. And how, 8 years later, one of the most sophisticated undercover operations in Australian police history finally caught the man responsible. The disturbing case of Daniel Morcombe. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching this from. And if you're new to this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe now, so you don't miss the next case we cover. All right, back to the story. December 2003, the Sunshine Coast, Queensland, a stretch of hinterland towns just north of Brisbane, where the pace of life slows down, and neighbors still know each other by name. Rolling farmland, quiet main streets, kids riding bikes to the corner shop. It's the kind of place where nothing much happens. The kind of place where a 13-year-old boy waiting alone at a bus stop wouldn't raise a single eyebrow. That was about to change forever. Daniel James Morcombe was 13 years old, and by every account, he was an easy kid to love. He lived with his family on a 5-acre property in Palmwoods, a rural pocket of the Sunshine Coast hinterland, with his parents, Bruce and Denise, his older brother Dean, and his twin brother Bradley. Daniel and Bradley weren't just brothers, they were best friends. Born minutes apart, they'd spent their whole lives doing everything together. School, motorbikes, horses. What one did, the other did too. To strangers, Daniel could come across as quiet, even shy. But to the people who actually knew him, he was warm, funny, a little boisterous, the kind of kid who'd pick flowers on the walk home from school just to see his mum smile. He loved animals. The family kept horses, chickens, ducks, a dog named Chief, and Daniel, who dreamed of becoming a vet one day, was the one who looked after them without being asked. He was, by his father's own words, an ordinary kid, a champion arm wrestler, a fan of wrestling on TV. Daniel Morcombe wasn't a headline. He was just a boy, reliable, dependable, the kind of son who didn't make his parents worry. Which is exactly what made December 7th, 2003 so unsettling, right from the very first hour. It was the height of an Australian summer. School holidays had just begun. Christmas was 2 weeks away, and Daniel's 14th birthday was only 12 days out. Daniel had a plan for the day: catch the bus into the Sunshine Plaza shopping center to buy presents for his family, and grab a haircut before the holidays properly kicked off. It was something he and Bradley usually did together. He begged his twin to come along, but the weather wasn't great that day, and Bradley decided to stay home. So Daniel went alone. He made the short walk to the spot where the school bus usually stopped, a patch of road beneath the Keel Mountain Road overpass. It wasn't an official bus stop. There was no sign, no shelter, no marked pole. It was just a stretch of roadside that locals and drivers alike had quietly agreed to treat as one, for years, without incident. Daniel stood there that afternoon with a bit of cash in his pocket, thinking about Christmas presents and a haircut, completely unaware that this ordinary errand on this ordinary road was about to become the last thing he'd ever do. 1:35 p.m. That was the bus Daniel was supposed to catch. It never came. The service had broken down somewhere along the route. No warning, no announcement. Just an empty stretch of road and a boy standing under an overpass, waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. Eventually, a replacement was sent out to cover the route. But it was running late, and when it finally reached the Keel Mountain Road overpass, it didn't stop. The spot wasn't an official stop. No sign. No marker. And the driver, already behind schedule, drove straight past. Daniel was still standing there. The driver noticed him, radioed it in, told the depot there was a boy waiting back at the overpass. Send another bus. Help was on the way. Just a matter of minutes. But in those minutes, something happened. Witnesses would later recall two men near the overpass, close to where Daniel was standing, not rushing, not causing a scene. Just there. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Why would they? It was a Sunday afternoon, a quiet road. A boy waiting for a bus. 3 minutes. That's how long it took for the second bus to arrive. 3 minutes between the moment Daniel was seen standing at that overpass and the moment he wasn't. When the bus pulled up, there was no one there. No boy. No struggle. No sign that anything had happened at all. Just an empty road, an untouched bus fare in Daniel's pocket, and a family who had absolutely no idea that their son was already gone. By that evening, Bruce and Denise Morcombe knew something was wrong. Daniel wasn't the kind of kid who lost track of time. He didn't wander off. He didn't forget to call. When he didn't come home, his parents didn't wait it out. They called the police that same night. What followed would become the largest police investigation in Queensland's history. Search parties combed the hinterland. Police door-knocked hundreds of homes. Thousands of tips poured in, some useful, most not. All of them followed up regardless. Rewards for information climbed past $1 million combined, public and private. At one point, investigators even placed a life-size clay model at the overpass, built from witness descriptions, hoping someone, anyone, would recognize the face and come forward. And still, nothing solid. There were false starts. Persons of interest named, investigated, and cleared. One convicted child sex offender, released from prison just weeks before Daniel vanished, drew intense media and public scrutiny, enough to spark political controversy over his release. But the leads went nowhere. Years passed. No body. No arrest. No answers. By 2010, the Morcombes had waited nearly 7 years, so they pushed for something the case had never had. a coronial inquest, forcing witnesses and persons of interest into a courtroom under oath, where silence was no longer an option. The inquest ran from October 2010 into 2011. One by one, witnesses were called. The bus driver, locals who'd noticed strangers near the overpass that day, and a number of men police had quietly suspected for years. One of them was a name that meant nothing to the public yet, a man who lived not far from where Daniel disappeared. In March 2011, he was called to testify. Under oath in open court, he looked Daniel's parents in the eye and told them he had absolutely nothing to do with their son's disappearance. Bruce and Denise Morcombe believed him. They had no reason not to. It would be months before they learned the truth that the man sitting across the courtroom that day already knew exactly what had happened to their son. Not far from where Daniel disappeared, in the town of Birwa, lived a man named Brett Peter Cowan. He wasn't a stranger to police. Just 2 weeks after Daniel vanished, Cowan was brought in for questioning. His name flagged because of his criminal history and his proximity to the overpass that day. He denied it then. He'd deny it again years later at the inquest. The same denial you just heard, delivered with the same straight face. His alibi shifted depending on who was asking. At one point, he said he'd only been on that road to pick up a mulcher. At another, he claimed he'd spent the afternoon visiting his cannabis dealer. But when police checked, the dealer wasn't even home that day. The story didn't hold up, and yet, without a body, without forensic evidence, without a single thread connecting him directly to Daniel, there was nothing to charge him with. For years, the case's attention drifted toward another suspect instead, a man whose vehicle seemed to fit the picture just as well, if not better. Meanwhile, Cowan simply carried on. On paper, he looked like a man who'd turned his life around. After his release from prison in 1998, he'd moved to the Sunshine Coast, thrown himself into a local church, and met a woman named Tracy through the congregation. They married in 1999. They had a child together. For years he attended services regularly. No new convictions. No red flags. Just a church-going husband and father living a quiet suburban life in Birwa. The same town, the same year, that a 13-year-old boy vanished less than an hour's drive from his front door. He and Tracy divorced in 2004. At some point in the years that followed, he changed his name. One more way of putting distance between himself and December 7th, 2003. Daniel and Brett Cowan had no connection to one another. No shared history. No relationship of any kind. Daniel Morcombe was simply a boy standing at a bus stop, and Brett Cowan was a stranger who happened to be driving past. Because to understand what happened to Daniel, you have to understand who Brett Cowan already was, long before that overpass. His troubled history went back further than most people realized. Cowan would later admit, under oath, that his offending began when he himself was still a child, no older than 9 or 10. By the time he was an adult, he'd already caused serious harm to a number of children. His first known conviction came in 1987, after an incident at a public playground involving a young boy. He fled afterward, spending nearly 2 years evading authorities before he was finally caught and sentenced. 6 years later, in 1993, he offended again, this time in Darwin, in an incident involving a 6-year-old boy that left the child seriously injured and requiring urgent medical care. The boy managed to get help on his own. Cowan denied everything at first, at one point even telling police he hoped they'd catch the person responsible. He only admitted the truth once the officers told him they already had the evidence. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. This was the man living quietly in Birwa in December 2003. Not a first-time offender. Not someone with an unclear past. By the time Daniel Morcombe disappeared, Brett Cowan was a convicted repeat offender with a documented history of harming children he'd never met before. Approached at random, in public places, in a matter of moments, Daniel wasn't an isolated incident. He fit a pattern Cowan had already shown investigators. Years before anyone connected the dots, by 2011, investigators had exhausted almost every conventional option. No body, no physical evidence, no witness who could put Cowan and Daniel together in the same place at the same time. Just a shifting alibi and a gut feeling that had lasted nearly 8 years. So Queensland police turned to something far less conventional. It's called a Mr. Big operation, a technique where undercover officers pose as members of a criminal organization, slowly drawing a suspect into their world. Small favors, small jobs, the nothing that feels dangerous at first, just enough to build trust, enough to make a person feel like they belong somewhere. The end game is always the same. Once that trust is real, the suspect has walked into a situation where confessing to their actual crime feels like the price of admission into something bigger. In April 2011, an undercover officer took a seat next to Brett Cowan on a flight to Perth. He introduced himself as a man named Fitzy, Paul Fitzsimmons. Friendly, easygoing, the kind of person you wouldn't think twice about talking to. Cowan didn't know it, but Fitzy was police. Over the following months, Fitzy and Cowan became close. Cowan was gradually pulled into what appeared to be a powerful criminal network, introduced to other members, given small tasks to complete, minor errands dressed up as jobs for the organization, nothing enormous, just enough to keep him coming back, just enough to make the fictional world feel real. And with every task completed, the promise got bigger. Cowan was told there was serious money on the table, the kind of payout that could change his life. But there was a catch. To get in on it, to become a real trusted member of the organization, he needed to prove himself first. One final task. One last show of loyalty. And Fitzy had one more introduction to make. To the man at the very top of the organization. A man named Arnold. August 2011. A hotel room in Perth. This was the moment 8 years of investigation had been building toward. Cowan sat across from the man he knew as Arnold, believing him to be the head of the organization, the one person whose trust mattered most. If he wanted in, this was it. This was the test. So Cowan talked. He told Arnold that on December 7th, 2003, he'd been driving along Nambour Connection Road when he saw Daniel, alone, waiting by the roadside. He pulled over, offered him a lift. Daniel accepted. Cowan drove him roughly half an hour away to a secluded property near Birwa. Once there, he admitted, he attempted to molest the boy. Daniel resisted, and in that moment, Cowan grabbed him by the throat. By the time he let go, Daniel was dead. Prosecutors would later tell the court that Daniel was almost certainly killed within an hour of being taken, meaning that even as his parents were still going about their afternoon, unaware anything was wrong, their son was already gone. Cowan told Arnold he disposed of Daniel's body in nearby bushland and thrown his clothes into a creek. Every word was being recorded. Days later, on August 13, 2011, Cowan led undercover police to the exact site where he said he'd left Daniel's remains. The same stretch of bushland you saw at the very beginning of this video. He was arrested on the spot. 8 years, one confession, and it was finally over. With Cowan in custody, forensic teams returned to the site, carefully recovering what remained. In the end, 17 bones were found, a rib, a hip, fragments of a leg, an arm, vertebrae. To confirm what everyone already feared, investigators turned to something achingly ordinary. Daniel's old toothbrush, still holding his DNA after all those years. It was a match. Nearly 9 years after he vanished, Daniel Morcombe was finally laid to rest. His funeral was held in December 2012 at the college he would have attended. More than 2,000 people came to say goodbye to a boy most of them had never met, but felt, in some way, they'd come to know. Then came the trial. It began in February 2014 in the Supreme Court of Queensland. Over the following weeks, the prosecution called 116 witnesses and presented more than 200 pieces of evidence. Cowan pleaded not guilty to every charge, and he never once took the stand in his own defense. No explanation, no testimony. Just silence from the man who had already confessed everything to a stranger he believed was a criminal. On March 13, 2014, after 7.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of indecently dealing with a child. Guilty of interfering with a corpse. Brett Cowan showed no reaction at all. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole not before 2031, meaning the earliest he could ever walk free is nearly 3 decades after the day he took Daniel from that bus stop. In the courtroom that day, before sentencing, Daniel's family finally had the chance to speak directly to the man who took him. Bruce Morcombe stood first. He told Cowan that a decade earlier, he'd made a choice that tore their family apart. He said he often thought about how many other victims Cowan had left behind, unseen, unspoken for. He said simply sitting in the same room as him was revolting. When Bruce finished speaking, the courtroom broke into applause. Denise's statement was read aloud to the court. She said she'd made a promise to Daniel that she would find him and that justice would be done. This day, she said, didn't bring closure. But the streets at least were safer. Then came Bradley, Daniel's twin. He spoke of everything that was never going to happen now. Daniel wouldn't be there to share a beer with him as adults, wouldn't stand beside him as best man on his wedding day. All the ordinary milestones twins are supposed to share quietly erased the moment Cowan made his choice. Cowan appealed his conviction the following year, arguing that his own recorded confession shouldn't have been allowed as evidence. On May 21, 2015, the appeal was dismissed. Queensland's Attorney General also pushed back in the opposite direction, arguing Cowan's 20-year minimum sentence should be extended. That request was dismissed too. The verdict and the sentence stood exactly as the jury had decided. In the years that followed, Bruce and Denise Morcombe turned their grief into something lasting. They founded the Daniel Morcombe Foundation, dedicated to teaching children about personal safety and keeping their son's memory alive in a way that could actually protect others. Every year since, Australians mark Day for Daniel, a day built around one simple symbol, a red shirt, the color Daniel was wearing the day he disappeared, now worn by children and adults across the country, as a quiet reminder to stay safe and to look out for one another. And in late 2025, Queensland went further, introducing the state's first public child sex offender register, named, fittingly, Daniel's Law. More than 2 decades on, his name still means something, not because of how he died, but because of everything his family refused to let that loss become. Silence, forgetting, moving on as if nothing happened. It started with a boy waiting at a bus stop that wasn't even official, a boy who just wanted a haircut and some Christmas presents for the people he loved. He never made it home, but he was never forgotten either. If this video moved you, consider subscribing.